there's a great deal more license about sex and political matters, but also greater license, I think, in thought, which comes out very unexpectedly, I always find, in Measure for Measure, and is very difficult to cope with, I think, which is that the disguised Duke, who one has to remember at any moment can snap his fingers and say, I am the Duke, and I pardon Claudio, and he is to be released, goes to Claudio in the guise of a friar, and tries to convince him that death is a very desirable thing, and has this extraordinary speech. And again, be absolute for death. And be absolute for death contains about 10 thoughts, each of which starts on a half line. So the idea is that they tumble out. I think Shakespeare was a great tumbler outer, but so were a lot of the other writers. You know, we have this thing about Shakespeare never blotted a line, although this is contended because we can see that various revisions were made. But I think that one of the things I think about Shakespeare, particularly in the big speeches, the soliloquies, is that you get a headline at the top, the quality of mercy is not strained, ought to be or not to be, that is the question. You think, here we're going to have a rational, well-ordered laying out of this headline, and then you find it's no such thing, that it tumbles out, it twists this way, it twists that way, it goes off in another direction, and then finally it comes to some sort of conclusion. Brutus's soliloquy in Julius Caesar, so here we are at 1600, is a very good example of this, where he twists and turns about, he may turn himself into a monster. Well, he hasn't actually done that yet, but he might do, so we better do, or had we, should we? Brutus is a wonderful example of the way we actually think as we think through these problems, twisting and turning, rather than giving a well-ordered dramatic speech. So out tumbles the Duke, trying to persuade Claudio, who has said, I desire life, but I'm prepared to die. And the Duke says, be absolute for death. Either death or life shall thereby be the sweeter. Reason thus with life, if I do lose thee, I do lose a thing which none but fools would keep. A breath thou art, servile to all those skyey influences that does this habitation where thou keepst hourly afflict. Nearly thou art death's fool, for him thou labourst by thy flight to shun, and yet runs towards him still. Thou art not noble, for all the accommodations that thou bear'st are nursed by baseness. Thou art by no means valiant, for thou dost fear the soft and tender fork of a poor worm. And on he goes. So each sentence, as you can see, is about 2.5 lines. It's quite compact, but sometimes so compact that it's difficult at first to untangle it. If you look at, thou art not noble, for all the accommodations that thou bear'st are nursed by baseness. And this is a very profound thought, that all the accoutrements of high living, of culture, of money, are all based, are all founded on baseness. And you think suddenly, we think about the super rich today and the way that their money has come through people being exploited on $1 a day in India or Africa or something like this, and that Shakespeare is producing a very profound universal thought about high wealth always being based on the exploitation of others. But it's very compacted, the way he puts it. And then, thou art by no means valiant, for thou dost fear the soft and tender fork of a poor worm. I always find this interesting because literally the soft and tender fork of a poor worm seems to indicate a snake which will kill you. But of course, directly we hear about worms, I always feel that we are talking about the grave and the way that worms will devour you. So you're not valiant because actually you're frightened of the poor worm devouring you. And this idea that thou, death's fool, for him thou labourst by thy flight to shun, so we're constantly running away from the idea of death, but at the same time we're running always towards death each year that passes. And there's something about this, I was thinking about this, that makes me think, who is the most quoted British poet of the last 50 years? Not necessarily the best, but the most quoted is probably Philip Larkin. And Larkin had this ability, I think, to take a thought slightly off kilter, slightly surprising, but universal, so that when you think about it for a moment, you recognize it as something immediately, and to couch it in very memorable, terse language. I'm not saying that Larkin is anywhere approaching Shakespeare, but I think one of the reasons that he's so memorable and quoted is precisely this kind of ability. And the verse, as the 1600s go on, because here we're sort of around about 1604-5 with Measure and All's Well, and through some very knotted stuff in Cymbeline, for example, and then we get to Leontes, where you feel that Shakespeare is absolutely going for broke in breaking things down. So Leontes, in the first scene, suspects that his wife Hermione is unfaithful. And Shakespeare, of course, maddeningly leaves out any indication of whether he's been thinking this for months or whether it's just a sudden thought, that he suddenly sees her with Polixenes and goes snap like that. I think she's unfaithful. I think that's what Shakespeare intends, but sometimes you could wring his neck because he won't make this clear to you. But Leontes watches the two of them, Hermione and Polixenes. Hermione is pregnant, of course, and Polixenes together. And he says, I am angling now, though you perceive not how I give line. Go to, go to. That's the only 4 words of that line. And so we take from that there's a pause while he watches them. Go to, and he watches them for the rest of the line. How she holds up the neb, the bill to him, and arms her with the boldness of a wife to her allowing husband. I love allowing husband, because here again Shakespeare had this genius for choosing words that can have a double meaning, you know. Of course a husband allows a wife to put her arm through his as they walk, but at the same time, how much is a husband going to allow? How much is he going to be forced to allow in terms of adultery? Gone already, they're gone. Inch thick, knee deep, o'er head and ears a forked one. Go, play, boy, play. And I do it like that because in at any rate our text there's a comma between each. Interesting that, isn't it? Go, play, boy, play. Thy mother plays, and I play too, but so disgraced a part whose issue will hiss me to my grave. And here Shakespeare picks up this word play, which of course he loves so much, and manages to get, as it were, 3 meanings into it. That the boy plays as children play. The mother is playing at adultery with a friend and suitor. And I play too, but I'm playing a part. I'm playing the part of the cuckold, whose issue will hiss me to my grave. Wonderfully compact thought about the baby they have is, for the rest of my life, going to, what an odd word to choose, hiss. And you hear the hiss of courtiers, perhaps. You know, yes. She isn't really Leontes' daughter, you know. Hiss goes on. Hiss me to my grave. Contempt and clamour will be my knell. And then he repeats, go play, boy, play. This is fixed on his mind. This idea of playing. There have been, or I have much deceived, cuckolds ere now, so at last we return to something normal and presentable. But this fragmentation of the verse is something that obviously the Jacobeans relished and began to demand.